Cowardice drives grievance. Just ask the NFL. The NFL recently announced several proposals to increase diversity within professional football. A few years ago, the NFL demonstrated its commitment to diversity by pledging $100 million towards social justice causes. Paying off activists was supposed to silence the racist accusations towards the NFL after the Colin Kaepernick flag-kneeling debacle. But the left is insatiable. Shelling out truckloads of cash to grievance groups attracts more predatory behavior than Bill Clinton and Joe Biden at a high school cheer competition. There's an abundance of rich white people naive enough to believe that appeasing leftists will cause some sort of ceasefire, but it never does. Cowardly compliance only creates new targets for future shakedowns. When wolves identify a wounded animal, they'll target the weak prey and swarm. Similarly, anyone attempting to keep activists away by apologizing or donating to their causes will only receive increases in harassment. Insatiable activists are never satisfied, especially when grievance pays so well. The NFL is a perfect example. 70% of NFL players are black. The black population is only 13.4%. This overrepresentation of a preferred identity group in such a lucrative profession should be a shining star for the diversity brigade, but it's not. A high-profile platform like the NFL is too essential not to leverage for leftist causes. If the NFL is willing to grovel to the race mob, then racism must be manufactured on an ongoing basis. A recent example of NFL racism is that only 29% of NFL analysts are black. Notice the significant bait and switch in this complaint. What they're saying is NFL analysts should not reflect the demographics of the general population, but instead mimic the overrepresentation of black NFL players. Since 70% of players are black and only 29% of analysts are black, this gap is only the product of racism. Presumably, the NFL would need 70% of its analysts to be black in order to not be racist. But even if the NFL were to mandate that 70% of analysts must be black, this would not solve the racist problem in football. Activists would pivot to denouncing the NFL for its lack of Muslim punters or something. NFL racism doesn't stop there, though. During the 2018 season, only 19% of national and regional NFL broadcasters were black. By previous standards, same with the NFL analysts, this would make black people overrepresented relative to their 13% of the population. But since the new rule is 70%, this discrepancy indicts the NFL and media networks of white supremacy. For the grievance army, overwhelming the enemy with multiple attacks is a winning strategy. Each attack on its own might be absurd, but a high volume of frivolous attacks makes the overarching claim seem a lot more legitimate. More complaints follow about the NFL's lack of diversity in coaching staff and management. Going into 2020, there were only 4 NFL coaches of color. With 32 NFL teams, 12.5% of the league is far from the 70% standard. One solution proposed rewarding teams with higher draft picks for employing more coaches and managers of color. Teams with the correct racial mix will jump ahead of competitors in the draft. This proposal suggests the solution to racism is openly discriminating against white people and patronizing black people by granting competitive advantages to their employers. No matter how much society has progressed, the left's inherent racism refuses to subside. With exception to their affinity for baby murdering and disdain for God, the bigotry of low expectations towards black people is probably the most repulsive aspect of leftism. Since 2003, the NFL has instituted the Rooney Rule, requiring teams to interview at least one minority candidate for open head coaching positions. This presumes black coaching candidates are incapable of elevating themselves in their profession without the altruistic hands of leftists to hoist them up. The Rooney Rule became a sham primarily because owners already know which coach they want to hire many times before they even interview any candidate. What the Rooney Rule is especially good at is wasting everyone's time and making leftists feel good about themselves. But black coaching candidates aren't as stupid as racist Democrats think they are. Many of them resent participating in the racist charade. A former NFL coach told CBS, "You have the pressure from the Fritz-Pollard alliance to take any interview you are offered, even if you felt like you were just being used." The Fritz-Pollard Alliance is a nonprofit founded by Johnny Cochran, yes, that Johnny Cochran, which exists to champion diversity in the NFL. But the Rooney Rule did not have its intended effect. Like many government regulations or diversity initiatives, when the stupid idea fails, the only solution is more. Now the NFL will be expanding the Rooney Rule to require interviewing at least 2 minority head coaching candidates. Doubling down on a stupid and racist rule or penalizing teams for improper demographics will not solve the NFL's racist problem, because it's not solvable. Marxists are never satisfied. Appeasing them is a fool's errand. With every inch of ground, they only salivate for more. In January of 2019, 8 NFL coaches were fired. 5 of them were black. This sparked the expected indignation from journalists. It doesn't matter that only one of the 5 coaches had a winning record, and none of them had ever won a playoff game. The 5 coaches' combined record was 174 wins to 233 losses, roughly the equivalent of a 7-9 record per season. The questionable performance of these coaches did not stop headlines from reading, "The NFL's push for more black coaches is hurt by nepotism and white boardrooms." ESPN's Stephen A. Smith and Roland Martin discussed the NFL's white supremacy for not hiring enough black coaches by saying, "Folks, here's the reality in the NFL. This boils down to whites. Whites. What you're seeing with the issue of whiteness in the NFL can be applied to corporate America. It applies to the folks who are on boards of directors. The reality is that whiteness is still a major issue in this country." Reminder, this is an industry with 70% of players are black, and they're also overrepresented in NFL analysts and broadcasters as well. Former NFL player Ben Watson describes his frustration with NFL's racism in coaching and upper management, saying, "A lot of times you'll hear white people say they don't want to hear about this. They'll ask you, why do you have to talk about race? Race is the context by how we live in this country. It always has been, and it will be for a long time." I have no idea what that means. I don't know what race is the context by how we live in this country means, but it sounds vague enough to be useful to those committed to never-ending grievance. The NFL's spinelessness has become so pathetic that athletes in other sports are also piling on. NBA star LeBron James criticized the slave mentality of NFL owners by saying, in the NFL, they got a bunch of old white men owning teams and they got that slave mentality. It's like, this is my team, you do what the F I tell y'all to do, or we get rid of y'all. LeBron explains NFL racism through a theoretical quote where owners insist that they own the team and insubordinate employees will not remain employed. While LeBron may be accustomed to pushing business owners around, for many of us, a business owner threatening to remove insubordinate employees is not out of the norm. And you're going to find many, many, many more of these sorts of accusations going forward. Complying with Kaepernick's protest or donating $100 million to social justice causes only made the bullseye on the back of the NFL larger. If the NFL had stood firm and unapologetically proclaimed that professional football is about performance and nobody cares about race, they still would have been accused of racism, but they could have held on to their self-respect. The Washington Redskins have been racist for a decade now and they still have fans. Instead, the NFL chose the more gutless route and surrendered control to leftism. Now they're on the Marxist leash. Once industries cave to the grievance army, they have no choice but to continue. It is a lifelong sentence with no appeals process. The insatiable nature of leftism has demonstrated cowardice only drives more grievance. Like a game of whack-a-mole, as soon as one complaint is addressed, 2 more charges show up. The NFL deserves no empathy because they've brought this on themselves. In the short term, the NFL will be fine, but over the long haul, they're in trouble. Out of their desperation to keep their cash cow full of milk, the NFL will gradually implement every demand of left-wing activists, as we've seen in recent weeks. With each disgraceful submission, any remaining respect the NFL had with fans will wither away until followers eventually tune out. The NFL's infected themselves with a poison by which there is no antidote but courage. These days, few corporations have courage. For business owners desperate to get in the good graces of leftism, they are far more likely to die by 1,000 paper cuts than they are to develop courage.